In 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, combat is the most structured pillar of play. A lot of players get excited because during this part of the game, they get to express their mastery over the system's rules. They have to manage actions, bonus actions, movement, spell slots. But a lot of new players can sometimes end up disappointed because how they think something is going to resolve in the game is different than what they expect. Hi, I'm John from Incendium D&D, and today we're counting down the top 5 strategic combat mistakes that I see in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. So, before we get to our countdown, I am going to start with a small disclaimer. When we're counting down these top 5 combat mistakes, we're looking at this purely from a tactical perspective. Over the years, I've gamed with a lot of players that have intentionally made bad combat decisions because it fit their character's story. Whether their character was taunted by the big bad villain into doing some kind of mistake, or because their character was impulsive or cowardly. For whatever reason, they didn't make the smart choice when initiative was rolled. And I'm not here to discount that type of play. And I'm not here to tell you how to have fun. But what I found over the years is these top 5 common mistakes are usually ones where players end up disappointed and not having as much fun. And I'm also not going to leave you hanging. So for each of these mistakes, I'm also going to give my little advice to maybe help you learn how to use each of these features of the game a little more effectively, which can save your party from a TPK. So without further ado, let's get started. Counting down from the top, strategic combat mistake number 5 is wasting limited resources. I find that usually this one happens because an overly excited player really wants to quickly get to the coolest parts about their character, and they end up using one of their best ability with limited uses in a situation that doesn't call for it, so that when they really need it, it's not there for them. A really good example is a low-level spellcaster in their spell slots. I can't tell you the number of times I've had a new player roll up a 1st or 2nd level spellcaster. They only have 2 or 3 1st level spell slots, and as soon as a social interaction doesn't go the way they want, they try to cast Charm Person or something like it, but then they move through their spell slot so quickly that when they get to combat, they really only have cantrips to rely on, and they end up not having as much fun in that combat either. The same can be said for other characters, like a barbarian and their rage. In Lost Minds of Phandelver, which is a pretty common beginner module I see new DMs use, I've seen a lot of times where as soon as we get into our first fight and initiative is rolled, the barbarian immediately rages. But the thing about modules like that is there are times where you go into a dungeon and there are, say, 3 to 6 or maybe even more combat encounters to navigate. And so if your barbarian is raging every combat, pretty soon by the time you get to the dungeon's big bad boss, you don't have your power when you need it. Now, the reason I rank this one at number 5 is because in a way, you can abstractly argue all of the other ones following it are going to be some kind of specific waste of a limited resource. But because of that, we can point back to this one as a general mindset of conserving your resources until you really need them. You don't have to be too stingy either. I've also had players play very conservatively and then end up disappointed at the end of a session or the end of an adventure because they had a lot of really cool spells they ended up never using because the team was so strong and optimized to begin with. So really, this is a balance you're going to find table to table. In fact, a lot of abilities recharge on either short rests or long rests, and I've found that a lot of tables, the way they structure their rest economy is that usually there's like, say, 80% social interaction exploration, followed by 1 or 2 big set piece encounters. And after each big combat encounter, the players get a long rest, meaning that all those smaller abilities that reset on short rest basically only get to see long rest recharges. So classes like Fighter and Warlock that have a lot of features that can recharge on short rests really don't feel as valuable because every single fight the team is fully refreshed before they go in. And that's something more for a dungeon master to consider. How frequently am I going to allow my players to long rest, and how will that start to devalue certain options that they have when building their characters? Moving on to strategic combat mistake number 4, which is misusing AOE spells. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole debate here about are blasting spells worth it in 5th edition. One of my favorite content creators, Treant Monk, already has a great video explaining this, which we'll link in the description below. But to sum up the mistake here, I often see players use blasting spells even if there's only a single target. It's like they see how many damage dice get rolled, and so they're willing to use their spell slot to cast the spell, thinking that it's going to be effective against one target or multiple. My favorite example to bring up here is Fireball. It's a 3rd level spell with a 20-foot radius, and it does 8d6 fire damage, which is pretty good for a 3rd level spell, especially if your character is, say, 5th or 6th level and you're fighting creatures that are appropriate for that level. But if you do the math, 8d6 averages out to 24 points of damage. That's also assuming that a target is failing its save and lacks resistance to fire damage. Unfortunately, as you fight stronger and stronger monsters in 5th edition, fire actually tends to be a damage type that's pretty commonly resisted to, meaning if you're targeting a single monster with Fireball, 8d6 averages out to 24 points of damage. And that's assuming that a monster fails its dexterity saving throw and lacks resistance to fire damage. And let's say that you're 5th or 6th level characters and you're fighting a big bad boss monster. Even assuming both of those things, 24 damage isn't a lot to a lot of boss encounters in 5th edition, especially when monsters, say, have an upwards of 100, 200 hit points. You're using a 3rd level spell slot to deal a fraction, very small fraction of damage to its overall health pool, when that spell slot could have been used for, say, a counter spell or haste, a buff spell that could make another ally way more effective over a period of time. Now, where Fireball is really useful is clearing out crowds of enemies. The way I like to think about it is for each additional target that I can fit in the area of effect, I'm essentially dealing another functional 24 points of damage to each of those targets. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that my sorcerer has 6 thugs using the thug stat block in its area of effect. They're not dealing 24 points of damage, they're effectively distributing 144 points of damage, which is fairly significant and makes Fireball a spell worth picking up, but it doesn't make it effective in all contexts. So my advice here is that if you're going to be using a lot of blasting spells or AoE spells, don't use them unless you can fit at least 3 enemy targets inside the spell's area of effect. In 99% of cases, if you're gonna catch an ally in that area of effect without some sort of defensive feature that allows you to basically sculpt the spell around them, I probably wouldn't have the spell go off. There was like one time where I saw this strategy actually be useful, and it was a very specific ally that was caught in the AoE. It was a bear totem barbarian multi-class with rogue that had the evasion feature. So when they got caught in the Fireball, worst came to worst, they were gonna take maybe like 6 points of damage. And in all likelihood, because of the specific build, they were gonna succeed their save and take no damage at all. The amount of risk mitigation factors that went into that decision made it worth it to cast the Fireball spell even with the ally inside. It is so rare that that's actually gonna happen that my recommendation would be don't include your allies in your Fireballs. And on the topic of distributing damage, we're actually going to go to combat mistake number 3. Strategic combat mistake number 3 is targeting multiple enemies with your multi-attack. And I'm using multi-attack fairly abstractly here. I'm really talking about any time where you can roll attack rolls against single targets through, say, extra attack or twinning or quickening spells, or even a spell like Scorching Ray that allows you to fire multiple beams of it. Now, this has to do with action economy. As per the rules as written, a creature that has 1 hit point has the same action economy as a creature with full health. So I want to say, again, for the sake of argument, we'll use thugs, right? Let's just say your attack can deal 20 damage, and each thug with the thug stat block has 30 hit points. If I use my first attack to damage one thug for 20 damage, and then I use my second attack to damage another thug for 20 damage, then when their turn comes around, both of them have full action economies to use against me. Whereas if I stack the two attacks and I have both attacks aimed for the same single target, well, now I've removed that one target and I've removed their action economy from the equation, meaning now I've basically taken down a 2 against 1 into a 1 against 1. And it makes it much more likely that I'm going to survive the encounter, or at least avoid using limited resources in an inefficient way. And I'm not exactly sure where the motivation comes from. I'm wondering if there's some kind of cinematic going on in the player's head where they're just like turning around and hitting multiple people with their attack rolls. But this is a really inefficient way to distribute your character's potential damage. And so my advice for this one is, if your character has multiple attacks, take out one enemy unit at a time. And foreshadowing a little bit to a future combat mistake, if you notice one of your allies has started dealing damage to an enemy, also target that enemy assuming that they're in range and assuming that you aren't going to be punished for it. Now again, we're talking purely damage here. There are some times I've seen, say, like a monk character use the mobile feat and work their way around multiple enemies so that they can inflict conditions like stun on multiple enemy units. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about pure damage dealing here. And on the subject of targeting and timing, we're going to move on to strategic combat mistake number 2, which is mistiming your heals. Something that a lot of players have a hard time understanding in 5th edition is that healing and damage are not equal. And that's not true of every game of this genre. For example, JRPGs like, say, Final Fantasy, Bravely Default, Dragon Quest. In a lot of those games, their healing spells are equal, if not more powerful, than a lot of the damage dealing options that enemies have access to. It's a huge part of that game's gameplay loop, where, say, you have an enemy come up, they do a lot of damage to one of your allies, so you use your healing character to heal that ally back up to full and mitigate the damage. In a lot of cases, it's a really good strategy to have one character that all they do is healing spells that help keep the party members healthy. But in D&D, this just isn't the case. My favorite example to use are 2 spells, Cure Wounds and Inflict Wounds. Both of them require first level spell slots. They both have a range of touch. One of the differences is that Inflict Wounds requires an attack roll to go off, while Cure Wounds happens automatically. But if you look at their raw output values, you can start to see a big difference. Cure Wounds heals 1d8 plus modifier hit points. Inflict Wounds deals 3d10 necrotic damage. To create the assumptions here, let's just say that they're both first level casters, point buy, standard builds. A Cure Wounds will say do 1d8 plus 3 healing, meaning that the output range is between 4 and 12. Whereas Inflict Wounds, even though you don't get to add your modifier, will deal 3 to 30 points of damage. The ceilings aren't even close. And so, let's say that your character takes 15 points of necrotic damage, that Cure Wounds isn't gonna heal it up to full, even with a maxed out roll. And you can deal damage freely in 5th edition, whereas healing spells always cost a resource. So we need to use those resources as efficiently as possible if we want to maximize our probability for survival. Now, remember what we just talked about with targeting multiple enemies with single attack roll things. A creature with 1 hit point has the same action economy as a creature with full hit points. So I've found that a lot of times it's better to save your healing spells for when an ally gets dropped to 0 and then heal them back up, rather than trying to heal them and prevent them from dropping to 0. And again, this is using the rules as written. This isn't accounting for any homebrew you may have. But I want to go back to that Cure Wounds spell. Let's say we're fighting 4 goblins. 2 goblins come up and both of them hit your character. Goblins deal 1d6 plus 2 damage each. Both of them hit, both of them roll average. So your character now has to spend a resource, and if you're talking like 1st or 2nd level, one of 2 or 3 spell slots to try to mitigate that damage, the goblins are going to outpace the amount of damage that you can heal every single time. And that's why I believe playing a healing or support character is the hardest role to figure out in 5th edition D&D, because you have to be really good at managing your resources, and you have to be really good at knowing when to use a healing spell and when to back it off. Before moving on, there are 2 additional pieces of advice I have. First, if your character can heal, pick up a healing spell, but don't depend on that healing spell. Damage prevention is much more efficient than healing. So for example, let's say you're playing a druid. Casting Entangle and wrapping up some zombies is gonna be more efficient than trying to cover the damage that they're dealing with, say, Healing Word or Cure Wounds. Second, you can never go wrong with temporary hit points. Theoretically, healing can only bring your character's hit points up to a full amount, whereas features and spells that grant temporary hit points can break that upper limit. And ultimately, this leads us to what I consider the greatest and most common strategic combat mistake in 5th edition, which is forgetting that it's a team game. And what I mean by that is, if you're looking at the game tactically, your character is contributing to an objective that your team has. And there are a lot of support features in 5th edition. Heck, a lot of times if your table is playing by the flanking rules from the Dungeon Master's Guide, you can grant another ally advantage just by standing in the right place next to an enemy. Not to mention that wizards, druids, clerics, pretty much any of the spellcasters have some kind of way of granting their allies advantage. And that is a huge buff. Even if you have the most optimized rogue in the world, an optimized rogue is still not as good as an optimized rogue that was granted advantage because of an ally. So my advice here is, when you're building your character, don't only think about what they can do, think about how they may be able to set up an ally to be more successful. Even if you're playing a barbarian, which the features really are just like rage, your barbarian gets stronger, reckless attack, you hit more often. Setting up an ally could just be getting an enemy's attention so that they aren't thinking about the squishy spellcaster behind that piece of cover. And that frees them up to do their job better because they're not taking damage. Any ally can be supportive of another ally. And if you're expressing that through the game's mechanics in the most structured pillar of play, 9 times out of 10, that's gonna spill over into the other pillars of play too. If you're supportive of an ally during combat, they're probably going to be supportive of helping you achieve your character's goals outside of combat. And that's where you can get a lot of beautiful storytelling and character moments. So these are the top 5 strategic combat mistakes I see at the table. What about you? Would you rank these in a different order? Is there a combat mistake that I missed, or one that you've seen that's particularly common at your table? Let me know in the comments down below. And remember to like and subscribe for more easy tips to start off your adventuring career. Have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.